Todd, stop one more time. I forgot this part. Mike, we have a little goodie bag for you here, and I won't go through it all now because we wouldn't share exactly what size underwear you wore. But there's some memorabilia from Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency and the Wildlife Resources Foundation, and a couple other things in there that we just thought you might like and to kind of remember us by. So I'll give these to Todd here as well.
I sure appreciate it. I don't deserve all of this, I can tell you that. But I'll take it out on me at the first instance. Thanks a lot.
All right. Director Carter, one more time, please.
Well, this is the last presentation we'll do this morning. This one is for Mr. Steve Patrick. A lot of y'all already know this is a milestone for Steve, and this is his last commission meeting. We didn't sit down and try to figure out exactly how many he had actually attended, but Steve, of course, started out as a forester up on Catoosa for the state and on the wildlife management area side of things. He's been assistant chief of wildlife. He's been regional manager in Region 2, now assistant director for the last several years. Been a great friend to me, and a really good person to bounce things off of, and he's given a lot of supervision and a lot of guidance to a lot of us through the years that we really appreciate. I always am at a loss of words when people retire that have been for the agency for a long time, because this seems like saying thank you it just doesn't seem like it rises to the occasion for all the things that a person has done through the last 38 years of Steve's career. But anyway, Steve, if you'd come up here, we'd just like to formally say thank you for 38 years of faithful and dedicated service from your friends of the agency and the commission.
Well, Steve, like I said, the plaque doesn't do justice, but you've been an outstanding leader and a real asset to the agency, to the commission, and to the resources of our state. And we really appreciate all that you've done. And I hope Lanice's honey-do list just keeps getting longer and longer. But we really appreciate it. If any other commissioners want to give a little comment, we'll have a Steve moment.
Thanks, sir. Are you the one that released the hogs in Catoosa is what I want to know. I'm just now hearing that part of the story.
You've been there last night, you've just seen the result.
That's every place has someone who brings steadiness to the ship, regardless of what happens. And there's a lot of us up here who came in during a firestorm, and I have never seen anyone be as steady as Steve in a lot of the controversies we've had and a lot of the challenges that we've had. The smile is there. Frankly, I hadn't seen him mad. I'm almost afraid to see him mad. He's that steady. But what you have done for this agency, what you've done for this commission, quite frankly, what you've done for me personally, that steadiness will never be forgotten. It can't be replaced. And for that, thank you. Thank you for caring for us like you have over these years.
I've said every time I get a chance that one of the joys of being on the commission is getting to work around the professionals and the people that do for a living what we like to do as a hobby. And that includes you. And it's been a joy knowing you, and I hope you enjoy retirement and appreciate the service that you've given to the agency and the friendship you've shown me over the last few years.
All right. Moving on. Anybody else? Okay. Moving on to Mr. Mark Duda. Or Ed, would you like to introduce? You just keep going up there, so.
Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure for me today to introduce to you Mark Duda, if you don't know Mark. And some of you I know have seen Mark in the past, and he's done presentations. He's worked with us for several years. But before I formally introduce you to Mark Damian Duda, I'd like to introduce you to Mark that I've known for quite some time. A very personal fellow, a family man, lives in Virginia, and has just completed a new little getaway place in Virginia, right? And I'll never pronounce this right, but Chinkatink? Chinkatink, okay, I'll get it. He got a place that is idyllic, and if you're an outdoor lover, that's where you would want to be, surrounded by water on three sides at the Chesapeake Bay, and a beautiful view from there. And Mark enjoys the outdoors as well, and it's 14,000 acres that surround him, so that's a lot of yard to mow, but in any case, Mark enjoys it there. And I like to always bring out that he's no stranger to Tennessee. Back in when he was in the University of Tennessee, with the University of Tennessee, working 2 summers at the Youth Conservation Corps in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And Mark told me in the past that that's when he kind of realized that a person could actually have a career in wildlife management, and thought that might be something he'd enjoyed doing, and kind of credits Tennessee with having the greatest impact on his professional life in terms of the people he's worked with in any other state in the nation. So a little more formal introduction, I guess. Mark Damian Duda is the Executive Director of the Responsive Management, a survey research firm that specializes in natural resource and outdoor recreation issues. During the last 25 years, Mark's conducted more than 1,000 studies on how people relate to the outdoors. He's the author of 4 books on wildlife, including The Sportsman's Voice, Hunting and Fishing in America. If you haven't seen the book, it's a great read for folks who are in this profession and people who enjoy it. I would encourage you to get a copy of that if you haven't got one already. He's widely known for his survey techniques and is currently working under contract to assist with the experimental change in the national survey that's conducted every 5 years by the United States Census Bureau in conjunction with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. I've seen Mark conduct and present studies for several different organizations and all over the nation in different states, and has been a keynote speaker at several conferences I've been at. And then one or more of his recent presentations, the staff and I were talking, we said, wouldn't it be great if we could get Mark to come and speak to the agency, the commission, and a lot of our partner organizations which are with us here today, that realize where we're going into the future from what he's gleaned out of his studies. What's the future going to look like 25, 50 years from now? What's changing? What are people's attitudes toward wildlife? What do they think about paying for that? How, all those different things that I've asked Mark to touch on this morning. And as you will notice, we've set aside a much longer time block for Mark's presentation than we would for an ordinary section of a presenter. But he's really the center of the commission meeting today in terms of the information that we wanted to put forward. I encourage you to interact with Mark and ask questions and relate to the information that he'll bring forward, and I'll defer to Mark on the best way to do that. But in any case, it gives me great pleasure to ask Mark to come and speak with us today and let us know a little about where we are and where he thinks we might be going. The information he gives you, he doesn't editorialize, but if you ask him for an opinion, he will give you one on what he has before you. So with that, Mark Damian Duda.
Good morning. After you know somebody for about 20 years, you're always nervous when they start introducing you. You're like, that wasn't anything that when he asked me to develop an overview of who I was, I don't know where that ended up, but so I was a little bit nervous there in the time being. So thank you very much. Good morning. I've got about an hour and a half or so to do sort of an overview of how people relate to the outdoors. We're going to probably take a break maybe in about 30 minutes or so. So if that coffee is kind of doing its job and stuff, we'll take a break in a little while. So I'm not here to talk about sandhill cranes, so that's a relief. Talk a lot about controversial issues across the U.S., from wolves to grizzly bears to salmon issues. But today is a nice, easy overview in terms of what the public thinks and feels and knows about wildlife conservation. So if we could have the slides, please. I'm not sure how to do this myself. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having me. Commissioners, thank you. Director Carter, and a lot of my friends in the audience, thank you.
Just use the arrows.
So the arrow. So I wanted to start out with somebody, sort of a test here. Does anybody know who that is, or does anybody recognize who that is? That's Ed Carter when he was 5 years old. Yeah. Lassie's father, I've heard that. No, this is actually an important person in our profession. And really, in a lot of ways, even though he did a lot of his work in the 1930s, still has a hold over us. Usually you'll see photos of him later on in his career when he was at the University of Wisconsin. But he wrote books that you probably have read and have influenced certainly this agency. He wrote a book called Game Management. It was the first book about game management and wildlife conservation from a scientific perspective. He also wrote a book that I'm sure everybody in here has read called Sand County Almanac. Anybody read that? Yeah. Aldo Leopold, considered the father of wildlife management in the United States. And Leopold was a biologist, and a lot of what he did was oriented on the scientific management of wildlife conservation. But in 1943, he wrote something that has always stuck with me after I read it lots later. But he said, the problem of wildlife management is not how we should handle the deer. The real problem is one of human management. Wildlife management is considerably easy. Human management is difficult. And I want you to think about that, because this is sort of the traditional view of fish and wildlife management. We sort of fish and wildlife professionals are in the center here. And we deal with three different aspects of fish and wildlife management. We deal with fish and wildlife populations, we deal with habitats, and we deal with people. And I want you to think about how we deal with the three of those. Because when it comes to fish and wildlife management, when it comes to habitats and populations, we deal with those in very scientific ways. We would never just not look at the science. We would never not consult journals. We would go back to the scientific literature and develop management plans for those. And we approach those in very scientific, deliberate, and orderly processes. But when it comes to people, the human side of conservation, sometimes that can change. We read an op-ed piece. We heard somebody say this. We have a couple of hunters come to a commission and say, all hunters in Tennessee think this. But a lot of times we don't go back to the science. And so this sort of new profession within the field, the human dimensions or the people side of conservation, has arisen over the past 20 years to better understand people and the public in a very scientific and deliberate and orderly process. The people side, the scientific side. And that's where we've been involved for the past 25 years at Responsive Management. Responsive Management was actually started by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency is part of the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So the states in the West, your sister state agencies in the Western United States, started this and said, we're pretty good when it comes to managing wildlife. But when it comes to that people side of things, we really don't understand what's happening. And so they hired a number of people to bring these resources to the state agencies. They sort of kicked me out in 1990, and Responsive Management went private at that time, so I've been doing this as a private entity now for 25 years. But that's sort of the origin of Responsive Management. And over those 25 years, we've done work for every single state fish and wildlife agency. We presented our research to every single commission or board throughout the U.S., as well as about 15 countries abroad. We do work for every state fish and wildlife agency. We do work for a lot of the organizations that utilize your products or have businesses around products. Vista Outdoors, a lot of the ammo companies, Winchester, Federal Premium, Yamaha, and a number of other organizations. We do work for Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, Ducks Unlimited, National Wild Turkey Federation, then do a lot of work for the nation's universities as well in terms of research. So it's sort of a little bit of a background in who we are and what we do. So Ed asked me to sort of give a seminar and talk about some of the things that are important to you all in the coming few years. One is this whole idea of what do people think and feel and know about wildlife resources? What are their attitudes? What are their values? He asked me to talk about sort of the state of hunting and fishing participation. And with that, I know that you've had some new lands added to the agency. And he said, well, let's talk about sort of the future of outdoor recreation beyond hunting and fishing. He asked me to talk about demographic trends and what the big sort of pictures are in terms of the Southeast and the U.S. in terms of changing demographics. And then finally, he asked me to talk about funding issues. So sort of those four those broad topic areas is what I'm going to cover. And so I'm not going to sort of give you one study. I'm going to present a whole bunch of studies. An early report that we did called Wildlife in the American Mind, and just lots of studies that we've done for state agencies. I'm going to draw on some of the books that I've done, The Sportsman's Voice, some reports called The Future of Hunting and Shooting Sports, and just a lot of different things. Some of the viewing guides that I've done over the years in terms of people who watch wildlife, or so-called non-consumptive wildlife. So the point here is that I'm drawing from a lot of different studies that we've done over the years to sort of better understand what it is people think and know and feel about wildlife. From the outdoor recreation part, I've drawn from several different sources, something called the National Survey on Recreation and the Environment, the National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation, and then something called SCORPs, which are called Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plans. Every state in the nation has to develop one of those every 5 years to be available for federal funding. So that's sort of the things that we've sort of drawn on in terms of the literature and things I'm going to tell you. These aren't things I'm making up. This is hard research. And the methodologies that we use to do this are sort of numerous. We do something called qualitative research, such as gathering information at public meetings, focus groups, and then quantitative research, such as personal interviews, telephone surveys, mail surveys, web-based when appropriate, and mixed mode surveys. Now, those quantitative surveys, those phone surveys, are very scientific, and that's what primarily I'm going to talk about is research from a scientific standpoint. We have done research, as have other researchers, from a perspective of what data is the most valuable and what data is most valid. And one of the things that I can tell you that sort of, I always feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about in commission meetings, is that a lot of the data that's brought forth, or a lot of the opinions that are brought forth in commission meetings and in public meetings in general, really aren't reflective of the public at large. In fact, they've done studies where we've looked at the people who've come in and their attitudes about certain issues, and looked at sort of the hunters at large or the general population at large, and shown that those were quite different. So it's important to really rely on that real hard scientific research that's out there in terms of how people relate to a lot of these issues. So how good is this information? Well, in the 2012 election, using scientific research on public attitudes, in this case, how people were going to vote, researchers using these methodologies were able to predict that presidential election down to the last electoral vote. Did you know that? 2 days before the election, scientists, social scientists, knew how every single state was going to go. Not knew, but predicted how every single state was going to vote. And they were correct down to the last electoral vote. So when people say, well, how do we know that 17% think this or 60% say that? I can sort of say, well, we know because this has been sort of materialized when it comes to where it counts. So pretty important. So let's move from that background of who we are and what we do to some of the things that we know. And I'm going to talk about big, broad issues. And there may be some, well, how about this or how about that, or not in this case. But let's just talk in general about how the public views wildlife. What are their attitudes? What are their values? Well, the first thing we know is that the environment, when we talk about the environment as a big picture, is a mid to lower tier issue to the public. And you've seen in studies, maybe from Gallup or other places, things like the economy and healthcare are very important to people. And you see things like the environment way down there, and you think, well, you know, that seems weird. I don't know, it seems just more important than that, than it's just sort of this lower to middle tier type of a thing. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, but sort of in the grand scheme of things, the environment as a whole ranks a little bit lower than other things like economy, healthcare, and public education. But it's not the end of the story, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I also want to tell you that wildlife and habitat are important to the public. And study after study after study shows that. Whether it's our study, whether it's a Gallup study, whether it's the Yale Center for Environmental Law and Policy, where people say, you know, from a 60 to 70% range say that the environment in general is very important to them. So all of a sudden, this whole issue of that environment being a mid to lower tier issue is really not that true. I mean, it's pretty amazing that 73% of Americans in this case can say that compared to other issues, that the environment is either very important or the most important issue. In studies that we've done in the Southeast, this one for the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, where upwards of 90 to 98% of the Southeast residents, 18 and older, say that wildlife and the existence of wildlife is very important to them. Look at those numbers. Those are incredible numbers. And I've presented this data at a number of different places. I do a lot of keynote speaking. This one, I presented a lot of the data that wildlife and the environment were important to the public. And this one was at the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And a couple of speakers came in, said, yeah, we agree. One speaker said, well, I don't agree at all. People can say anything in a survey or a poll, oh, I care, but people don't put their money where their mouth is. And that was in 2012, a couple of months before one of the elections. And so I said, well, I don't agree with you. The research shows what it is. And now I'm going to show you some information that I gathered to sort of support that. In 2012, there were 57 statewide municipal county ballot initiatives on the ballot, 57 of them, and that were related to conservation, land preservation, and those kind of things. 46 of those passed, 46 out of 57. 81% of the voting aspects in terms of land conservation, I mean, just a whole variety of things, referendums and ballot initiatives passed. 81%, it's pretty good. Who wouldn't want 81% of the vote? In 2014, I did that analysis again, and 41 of 57, or 72% of those ballot initiatives and referenda passed. So people are putting their money where their mouth is in terms of voting themselves to be taxed for conservation purposes. So when people say, and they look at those big, broad numbers and say the environment is not important to people, I point to this and say, I think it is, because people are putting their money where their mouths are, and it's showing up everywhere you look. I mean, those are nice numbers. People don't have to vote to tax themselves. Yet in 2012 and 2014, 81% of those referendum ballot initiatives passed, And in 2014, 72% passed. Now, that brings up this whole idea of the environment, the environment. Well, the truth is that the public differentiates when they talk about the environment. Are we talking about sea level? Are we talking about habitat? Are we talking about wildlife? And so when you look, again, at various studies and surveys that we've done and other people have done, you see that they differentiate. Yes, climate change and sea level rise are lower on that totem pole of big, broad environmental issues, as opposed to things like water pollution or toxic waste or air quality. So when people talk about the environment, it's really important to start differentiating what we mean by the environment, if you will. Now, we also know when it comes to these big, broad topics on the environment that water resources is by far the most important resource to the public. I mean, every survey that we've ever done, every study anybody else has done, when they start looking at those various environmental issues, water quality comes to the very top. And so the more that you can relate your programs to water quality, the more that they're going to resonate with the American public and the Tennessee public. We also know that ecological values are more important than recreational values. And what I mean by that is when we talk about, well, I'm going to talk a lot about hunting and fishing, and those are important to people. But when you talk about, in this case, Delaware, I have lots of these in surrounding states, and have anything for Tennessee. Again, you can see how water resources, what we call existence values of wildlife, rise to the top, while recreational aspects aren't as important. And again, they are important. We're going to talk about that. But when you look at them in terms of a hierarchy, the issue of ecological values are more important than recreational values. This is a study we did for the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, your sister agency, where again, this hierarchy, if you will, sort of rises to the surface. Those existence values, those ecological values are more important than recreational values. Now, recreational values are important. We're going to talk about those, but they're not as important as those ecological values. And so it's important to know that. Are you a recreational agency or are you an ecological agency? Well, you're both, but those ecological values are going to resonate with more of the broader public than those recreational values. Again, I'm not diminishing those recreational values. So what does that mean in terms of communications? Well, let's talk about issues that are important to a lot of the agencies across the U.S., one of those being deer management. In a lot of states and a lot of counties, there's an overpopulation of deer. And yet, even in some of those counties and even some of those states, people want more deer. And so what do? What resonates from a communication standpoint? Well, this is actually from an Arkansas study for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission that we did this last year, to develop better communications. And so you could say, well, there's too many deer, and that results in more damage to the landscape or more crop damage, more issues that are economic or social based. Well, you know what? Those arguments don't resonate near as much as when you start focusing in on those ecological benefits. And so if I talk to these people and I say, if there are more deer, there are going to be more car accidents or there are going to be more damage to your landscape. They'll be like, yeah, okay, whatever. But if I start talking about that if there are more deer, it's going to harm the deer population, it's going to harm the habitats, that is going to resonate much more so than those people values. Does that make sense? Because it's important. So I'm sort of making 2 points here, how to communicate about some of these issues, but that broader aspect that those ecological values are more important than the recreational values. We know through various studies that the public feels the nation's wildlife populations are healthy. I grew up 20 minutes from Washington, D.C. Well, yeah, if you could drive there. It takes 2 hours because there's always cars. Senator Alexander knows that if he's trying to drive through anymore in Washington, D.C. But when I was a kid, we used to drive really long and far away down the Delmarva Peninsula to the eastern shore to see a species that was very rare at the time. A Canada goose. Now we've got geese in our backyard. We have deer in our backyard, 20 minutes from Washington, D.C. My mom actually just reported she has a fox, a red fox den in her yard. And so as these urban wildlife come into a lot of these areas that they weren't anymore, people get this impression that the nation's wildlife resources are healthy. Now, of course, there's issues of endangered species and stuff that are not true and don't hold up in that case. But in general, people feel pretty good about wildlife populations. And that, again, shows up in studies where they talk about, well, I think that wildlife is pretty healthy. I like this. Humanistic attitudes toward wildlife are more prevalent than ecological or utilitarian attitudes. And what we mean by a humanistic attitude is an orientation toward individual animals or seeing animals as pets. Ecological values is sort of self-descriptive. Utilitarian attitudes, sort of those use of wildlife resources, aren't near as held within the population as this young woman kissing the squirrel. I never really looked at that, but I guess so. So keep that in mind as well. And that manifests itself, and you've seen that, where people see those individual animals almost being more important than animal and wildlife populations. And that's very hard to deal with as a commissioner. How do you deal with that when you know what you're doing is right for the population, but not for the individual animal per se? In terms of this whole idea about how the public relates to wildlife, we know that something called mutualistic attitudes are becoming more prevalent than utilitarian, or what we call dominionistic attitudes. And the way that I can explain these whole attitudes, these dominionistic attitudes to the mutualistic attitudes, is to show you how people answer some of these questions. So I said that mutualistic attitudes are becoming more prevalent. And let's look at some of those mutualistic values in terms of how people relate. That more people value the sense of companionship I receive from animals. I feel strong emotional bond with animals. I take great comfort in the relationships I have with animals. It would be more rewarding to me to help animals rather than people. I care about animals as much as I do other people. Society is starting to shift more in that direction than in these dominionistic attitudes, such as humans should manage fish and wildlife populations so that humans benefit. The needs of humans should take priority over fish and wildlife protection. It is acceptable to use fish and wildlife in research, even if it may harm or kill some animals, and fish and wildlife are on Earth primarily for people to use. So again, we're sort of seeing a little bit of a shift in terms of public attitudes in that direction. This is from a study called Wildlife Values in the West that was conducted by the Colorado State University. What's really cool, and I want to tell you here, is that we just received a grant, over a $500,000 grant. It's actually almost $1 million grant, in cooperation with Colorado State University to study these attitudes in every single state in the nation, including Tennessee. So in about a year or two from now, we're going to have data on, specifically on the values and attitudes of Tennessee residents toward wildlife. And you'll be able to see those in relation to all of the states in the Southeast, as well as your sister states across the nation. Pretty cool study. Now, people care about wildlife, and they hold these various attitudes, but you know what? Man, they don't know a whole lot. They don't know a whole lot. I know you're all going, yeah, tell me something I didn't know. We had this guy come down from Virginia to tell us this. The public has low knowledge levels about fish and wildlife resource, and we see that in study after study after study. This is a study we did for a western state, I won't tell you what state, where people should know a lot about wildlife. And we asked various knowledge-related questions. And if I would have graded those as people grade your kids in school, 81% of those states' residents would have gotten an F on their knowledge toward wildlife. 0.2 would have gotten an A, and you can see the rest of the scale there. Those are some pretty ugly numbers. People don't know a whole lot about wildlife. People across the nation don't even know the agencies that manage fish and wildlife. When you ask them in an open-ended manner, who manages, who is the primary agency, state agency responsible for managing fish and wildlife in your state, be it Virginia, be it Tennessee, South Carolina, only about 20% of those people collectively can name their state agency. It's the game agency. It's the guys who do the conservation, the commission guys. Yeah, you know, those commission guys. Only about 20%. Now, in some states that varies, but collectively, not even a fifth of those people, and 50% of them just say, I have no idea. I have no clue. People don't know a whole lot.
You have results from Tennessee?
I do. I have results from Tennessee, but they're about 8 years old, but I can get those for you. I didn't present them because they were old. They were a little bit older. Agencies across the nation, about half of them, are funded primarily through hunting and fishing licenses and Pittman, Robertson, Walbro, Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration. Your agency, I think, is funded literally exclusively. Is that true, with the exception of the new legislation that purchased land? Is that true? Okay. So you depend on that. And so you would think that people would know how you're funded. So when you ask people, how is the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries or South Carolina Department of Natural Resources funded, people just say taxes. I want you to look down here how most of these agencies, this is from the Southeast as a whole, collectively. And when we did this study, we said the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation, et cetera. And most people just said taxes. And nothing specific, don't know. Look at this, hunting licenses, fishing licenses, state non-game checkoffs that a lot of the state agencies have, any kind of state wildlife grants, or even down here, those excise taxes. Yuck. People don't know how the heck you're funded. So when you start saying, well, we need money, we want this or we want that, they think, well, you're already being funded through general tax revenue. And so there's always a disconnect. But then you might say, well, Mark, that's the general population. They don't know nothing. How about the hunters? How about the anglers? Well, it doesn't get any prettier, really. When you separate out those who are hunters or anglers, you still don't get a majority of hunters and anglers who, again, this is in an open-ended manner, say, oh, it's through my hunting licenses. Oh, it's through my fishing licenses. I think, when I bought that new Beretta last week, they taxed it somehow, didn't they? Or my new Benelli for waterfowl hunting. I think that was an 11% excise tax. No, they don't say that. They really kind of sort of don't know. Even a majority of hunters and anglers don't really understand the importance of hunting and fishing licenses or those excise taxes collectively called Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration. That's not a good thing. We talk about this thing called the North American model of wildlife conservation. And for those of you who've gone to any kind of conferences with fish and wildlife agencies over the past few years, we've talked a lot about the North American model of wildlife conservation, that wildlife is a public trust, the international issues, and all those 7 tenets. And yet, again, if you ask people how much they know, even just the self-awareness, how familiar are you with the North American model of wildlife conservation? Yet, again, people are blank stares. I don't know what you're talking about. Now, there's good news, though. Now, although there's low awareness about fish and wildlife agencies, people can't name you directly. Oh, that's the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency established in blah, blah. They know you're sort of there. But the good news is that we have very high levels of credibility. They know somebody's out there. And when you ask about credibility issues, well, how credible? Would you say very credible, somewhat credible, or not at all credible? When it comes to sources of information about wildlife, how credible is the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals? I know you're really sad to see that at the very bottom, at 20%. But the agency, if they said the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation, we would say that this is the agency that is indeed responsible for Fish and Wildlife Agency in the state. The agency rises to the very top. They know you're out there, and you should feel very good in terms of levels of credibility. And so let's take a look at that. Look at the the National Wildlife Federation, a biologist with the agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, all of those things rank very high as opposed to even a professor at the university, at this land-grant university, or a local environmental organization or a local sportsman's organization. And I think this is important for you to know too, because a lot of times I'll work with agencies and they'll say, well, you know what, Mark, let's work with the local sportsman's club to get this message out because that would be the way to go. And the truth is that's not true, that you hold that credibility. Especially a warden or a wildlife officer in a uniform is considered extremely credible. And our studies, study after study after study, shows that. So they don't know a whole lot, but that they think you're credible. The public supports the state agencies providing hunting and fishing, even though they may not hunt or fish themselves. And again, a number of studies that we've done in a number of different states across the U.S. show that they may not hunt. Only about 6% of the American public hunt every single year, which is quite interesting. And yet you have a majority of people saying, you know what, that's pretty important that they're doing that. I might not hunt or fish myself, but I think it's important that the agency does that. And so again, I think that that's good news. We know that what people see in the media impacts their opinions, attitudes, and values. And sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not good. You've seen that before. And the media really can play an important role when it comes to how people view wildlife, whether it's through those anthropomorphic types of ways or other things in terms of Duck Dynasty or Pocahontas. We did a study, it was a really cool study a couple years ago for the Lincoln Park Zoo. And they were very concerned. I just want to point this out because I think it's interesting, and it's the real quantitative research that I have. But they were really concerned about people using chimpanzees in the media and sort of bringing them to people. For those of you who have watched the Super Bowl, do you remember this ad over here where the chimp was driving the car and it was wrecking the car and stuff? And these guys from the zoo were like, wow, this is really scary because people are going to start associating these things that chimps and people and that they're okay. Do you know that there's more chimpanzees in the U.S. captive than there is in the wild in Africa? And they're highly endangered. And yet, after we exposed, in this study, after we exposed images of people, ads, monster.com ads of people interacting with this highly endangered species, almost 40% of those people thought, well, maybe they're not endangered. Maybe it's okay to have one as a pet. And all of these things that we don't think are good for people to think about this incredible endangered species. And so, yeah, Mark, we're not zoos. Kind of keep moving on here. Well, but our public is constantly subject to things like Hunger Games and Catching Fire. These movies that show young women with arrows, which was a good thing, and showed a bump up in increase in archery participation. Do you know that the Olympics, the last time they were there, that archery topped the list in terms of how many people watched it from a cable perspective? Should you care? Yeah, you're darn right you should care, because some of your money is coming from those archers. That's part of the federal aid wildlife restoration money that is paying for part of this commission meeting even today. That's federal aid money. So sometimes it's good when people see these media images, and sometimes it's not good. But my point here now is simply to understand that what people see in the media can really affect their attitudes. We know they're increasing human-wildlife conflicts. Generally, about 26% of people in each state are experiencing some kind of wildlife damage. Some of my clients in the Northeast United States, Maryland and Delaware, are receiving 50,000 to 60,000 calls a year from people having deer damage and those types of things. You asked me to talk about conservation and how people relate to wildlife. And I'm going to talk about hunting and fishing and shooting and really fun, cool things. But also, we've got a large segment of our population who are having issues sort of known as nuisance wildlife or nuisance animal problems issues. We've got a lot of work, if you're interested in that topic, we've done a lot of work in the Northeast where it's sort of at its most, probably